June 4th, 1942. June 4th, 1940. Through the cockpit canopy, he could see 5 other torpedo bombers from Weihnacht preparing for takeoff, their wings folded upward like praying hands until deck crews locked them into flight position. Suspended beneath each aircraft's belly hung a Mark 13 aerial torpedo, a cigar-shaped weapon weighing just over 2,000 pounds that represented 4 years of desperate engineering effort to create something American torpedo bombers could actually deliver without killing themselves in the attempt. What Earnest couldn't know, as his Grumman TBF climbed toward the coordinates where Japanese carriers were supposed to be lurking, was that he was flying an aircraft that would fundamentally alter the balance of naval aviation in the Pacific, not because of any tactical genius or heroic sacrifice, but because engineers in Bethpage, New York, had finally solved a problem that had bedeviled every navy since torpedoes were invented: how to make a weapon powerful enough to sink a battleship, light enough for an aircraft to carry, reliable enough to actually run true toward its target, and survivable enough that the delivery aircraft wouldn't be blown out of the sky before bomb release. The Mark 13 torpedo hanging beneath Earnest's Avenger represented the American solution, and Japanese admirals who had spent decades perfecting their own torpedo warfare doctrine were about to discover that the rules had changed in ways they never anticipated. The story of how American torpedo bombers went from flying coffins to ship killers doesn't begin with heroism at Midway. It begins with failure, bureaucratic dysfunction, and a weapon so unreliable that pilots openly referred to it as the Mark 13 anchor because it did little except drag their aircraft down toward the waves, while enemy gunners tracked them with leisurely precision. To understand why the TBF Avenger carrying a 2,000-pound torpedo represented such a revolutionary development, you must first understand what American naval aviation was supposed to accomplish before Pearl Harbor, and why every assumption about torpedo warfare proved catastrophically wrong when combat began. In 1935, when the United States Navy issued specifications for a new torpedo bomber to replace the aging Douglas TBD Devastator, doctrine emphasized a delicate balance between range, speed, and weapon payload. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted an aircraft capable of delivering a torpedo from at least 10,000 yards, while maintaining enough speed and maneuverability to evade enemy fighters. The weapon itself needed sufficient explosive power to cripple capital ships, but couldn't weigh more than 1,500 pounds because existing carrier aircraft simply lacked the engine power to lift heavier ordnance while maintaining combat performance. This weight restriction had shaped American torpedo development since the 1920s. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo initially weighed 1,375 pounds, and carried a 405-pound Torpex explosive charge, substantially less powerful than the 2,200-pound warheads carried by Japanese-type 91 aerial torpedoes. American naval planners accepted this compromise, reasoning that lighter weapons meant faster delivery aircraft with better survival chances against anti-aircraft fire. The problem was that the Mark 13 didn't work at all. During pre-war testing, the torpedo demonstrated catastrophic unreliability. Drop it from altitudes above 50 feet, and the nose would dive into the water, breaking the weapon's back. Release it at speeds above 110 knots, and the tail fins would tear off from aerodynamic stress. Try launching it in rough seas, and it would porpoise across the surface, losing gyroscope alignment and running in circles. The depth mechanism routinely failed, sending torpedoes under their targets or skipping over them. The magnetic exploder, copied from German designs, detonated prematurely or not at all. Contact exploders proved almost as unreliable, requiring near-perpendicular strikes to trigger the firing mechanism. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button And let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Pilots training with Mark 13 torpedoes learned to dread their assigned weapon more than enemy fighters. The standard approach doctrine required boring in straight and level at precisely 90 feet altitude and 100 knots airspeed for at least 45 seconds before weapon release to allow the torpedo's gyroscope to destabilize. During those 45 seconds, the torpedo bomber presented a perfect target for every anti-aircraft gun within range. One pilot described it as flying into a wall of steel with your eyes open, knowing you can't dodge and can't speed up, and can't do anything except hold course and pray. Even when pilots executed perfect delivery runs, torpedoes struck their targets less than 10% of the time during pre-war exercises against obsolete battleships moving in predictable patterns. Against maneuvering warships with combat-experienced captains, hit rates would prove far worse. The TBD Devastator, which served as America's frontline torpedo bomber from 1937 until 1942, exemplified the compromises forced by inadequate torpedo technology. Designed by Douglas Aircraft Corporation, the TBD represented advanced thinking for its era, with features like hydraulically folding wings, an enclosed cockpit, and all-metal construction. When it entered service, the Devastator was faster than any contemporary fighter, but by December 1941, the aircraft was hopelessly obsolete. Maximum speed barely exceeded 200 miles per hour. Service ceiling was just under 20,000 feet. Range with a torpedo load was only 435 miles. Defensive armament consisted of a single 30-caliber machine gun in the rear cockpit. The Douglas TBD's greatest flaw wasn't speed or armament, but the fundamental tactical approach it embodied. American torpedo doctrine assumed that carrier aircraft would attack in coordinated strikes, with dive bombers and fighters suppressing anti-aircraft defenses, while torpedo planes made their runs. Pre-war exercises suggested this coordination would work. Combat would prove otherwise. When radio communications broke down, when fighters became engaged with enemy combat air patrol, when dive bombers attacked from different directions, torpedo planes ended up making uncoordinated attacks against fully alerted defenses. The results were catastrophic. At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, American torpedo bombers achieved minimal success. VT-1 from USS Yorktown attacked Japanese carrier Shoho, contributing to her sinking, but primarily because Japanese defenses were already overwhelmed by dive bombers, and the carrier was maneuvering to avoid other attacks. Against Shokaku, American torpedoes achieved no hits despite multiple attacks. Japanese combat reports noted that American torpedo planes approached slowly in predictable patterns, and their weapons were easily avoided by moderate course changes. 4 weeks later, at Midway, the true cost of inadequate torpedo technology and obsolete doctrine became horrifyingly clear. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 3 separate torpedo squadrons attacked the Japanese carrier force, with a combined total of 41 TBD Devastators. Vitacht from Hornet arrived first, approaching from the southwest without fighter escort or dive bomber support. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed all 15 aircraft. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean while watching. The rest of the battle unfolded around him. VT-6 from Enterprise attacked next, losing 10 of 14 aircraft with no torpedo hits. VT-Rai from Yorktown followed, losing 10 of 12 aircraft, again with no hits scored. In less than 30 minutes, 35 TBD Devastators and over 80 aircrew had been destroyed without sinking a single enemy ship or even damaging one with torpedo hits. The exchange ratio was so catastrophically one-sided that immediate abandonment of low-level torpedo attacks might have seemed the logical response. But Navy leadership recognized that the problem wasn't torpedo bombing as a concept. The problem was the weapon, the delivery aircraft, and the doctrine built around obsolete technology. What Ensign Earnest didn't know as he launched from Hornet that morning was that he was flying one of exactly 6 TBF Avengers that had reached the Pacific in time for Midway. His aircraft represented the Navy's desperate attempt to fix everything wrong with American torpedo aviation in a single revolutionary design. The Grumman TBF Avenger was substantially larger, heavier, and more powerful than the devastator it was meant to replace. Powered by a 14-cylinder Wright R2600 Cyclone radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, the Avenger could carry a 2,000-pound Mark Dreitzehn torpedo internally in a specially designed bomb bay while maintaining a maximum speed of 275 miles per hour. This represented a quantum leap in capability. The TBD could barely maintain 120 knots while carrying a torpedo externally. The TBF could hit 230 knots with a heavier weapon tucked inside its fuselage, dramatically reducing drag and improving survivability. The internal weapons bay solved multiple problems simultaneously. External torpedo carriage created enormous aerodynamic drag, forcing pilots to maintain slow, steady approaches that made them perfect targets. Internal carriage reduced drag substantially, allowing faster approaches and quicker escapes. The enclosed bay also protected the torpedo from slipstream damage during high-speed flight, permitting delivery at speeds that would have torn external weapons apart. Most importantly, the Avenger's robust airframe and powerful engine could lift a fully armed aircraft off carrier decks in combat conditions that would have made TBD launches impossible. But the aircraft was only half the solution. The Mark Dreitzehn torpedo itself underwent revolutionary modifications between 1942 and 1944 that transformed it from an embarrassing failure into a war-winning weapon. The catalyst was Captain William Samuel Parsons, known throughout the Navy as Deke, a brilliant ordnance officer who took command of the Navy's torpedo development program in mid-1942 and immediately began tearing apart every assumption about how aerial torpedoes had to function. Parsons recognized that the Mark Dreitzehn's fundamental problem wasn't the explosive charge or the propulsion system. The problem was that naval engineers had designed the weapon based on theoretical calculations rather than combat testing. Torpedoes that worked beautifully when dropped from test stands into calm harbors catastrophically failed when released from aircraft pulling high-G maneuvers into rough seas. The solution required extensive field testing under realistic conditions, with rapid prototyping of modifications based on immediate feedback from combat pilots. Working with a team at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, Parsons authorized changes that Bureau of Ordnance bureaucrats had resisted for years. Wooden nose rings were added to prevent the weapon from diving too steeply on water entry. Shroud rings around the tail fins prevented them from tearing off during high-speed release. Improved gyroscopes maintained directional stability even after violent water impact. The depth mechanism was completely redesigned to actually work as intended. Most radically, Parsons authorized replacement of the problematic magnetic exploder with a simple contact exploder that detonated reliably when the torpedo struck its target. By late 1943, the modified Mark Dreitzehn Mod 2 bore little resemblance to the pre-war failure. Pilots could now release torpedoes from altitudes up to 2,000 feet, though most preferred between 800 and 1,000 feet at speeds exceeding 250 knots. The torpedo would plunge into the water, stabilize within seconds, and run true toward its target with hit rates approaching 40% under good conditions. This transformation represented one of the war's most successful engineering rehabilitation programs, turning the Navy's most embarrassing weapon into one of its most effective. The combination of the improved Mark Dreitzehn and the TBF Avenger created a weapons system that fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of naval aviation. Japanese admirals, who had dominated carrier warfare in 1942 through superior aircraft, superior pilots, and superior torpedo technology, suddenly faced American torpedo bombers that could attack from longer ranges, at higher speeds, with more reliable weapons, and with substantially better survival chances. The psychological impact of this reversal would prove as significant as the material destruction American torpedoes began inflicting. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. American carriers launched massive strikes against Japanese fleet units with TBF Avengers forming the core of each attack group. Japanese combat air patrol fighters found the heavily armed, well-protected Avengers far more difficult to shoot down than the fragile TBDs they remembered from earlier battles. Japanese destroyer captains discovered that violent maneuvering no longer guaranteed torpedo avoidance. Improved Mark 13 ran faster, straighter, and more reliably than Japanese intelligence had suggested possible. When torpedoes struck home, the 2,000-pound warheads inflicted catastrophic damage that left even large warships dead in the water. But the true revolution wasn't just about aircraft or torpedoes. It was about doctrine, training, and the systematic application of lessons learned through brutal combat experience. The transformation of American torpedo doctrine began not in Washington conference rooms, but in ready rooms aboard carriers, where squadron commanders gathered after missions to debrief what had worked and what had gotten people killed. Lieutenant Commander John Collett, who took command of Torpedo Squadron 5 after the original commander was killed at Coral Sea, instituted a practice that would spread throughout the carrier force. Every pilot who returned from a torpedo attack had to describe in detail their approach, altitude, speed, release point, and the torpedo's observed performance. Collett compiled this information into detailed reports that went far beyond the standard after-action summaries, including recommendations for tactical modifications based on what pilots had actually observed rather than what doctrine said should happen. These reports revealed patterns that contradicted pre-war assumptions. Pilots discovered that approaching from the target's beam rather than bow or stern increased hit probability because ship captains had less time to turn into or away from the torpedo track. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions overwhelmed defensive responses, forcing enemy captains to choose which torpedo spread to evade while accepting hits from others. Most significantly, pilots learned that the improved Mark 13 allowed them to attack from altitudes and speeds that made enemy anti-aircraft fire far less effective without sacrificing weapon performance. By mid-1943, operational doctrine had evolved, substantially from the rigid pre-war procedures. Attack groups now approached at 12 to 15,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range, then split into multiple divisions that would descend on different bearings to attack simultaneously. Avenger pilots would push over into shallow dives, building speed to over 250 knots while descending to 800 to 1,000 feet for torpedo release. The high-speed approach compressed the window, during which enemy gunners could track and fire on the attacking aircraft. After weapon release, pilots would continue their dive to wavetop height, using the target ship's superstructure to mask themselves from anti-aircraft fire while escaping at maximum speed. This flexible approach doctrine represented a complete departure from the rigid, predictable patterns that had gotten so many TBD crews killed at Midway. Japanese fighter pilots who had learned to position themselves to intercept slow, straight-flying torpedo bombers found that Avengers diving from altitude at high speed were far more difficult to engage before weapon release. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners trained to track low, slow targets struggled to adjust their fire solutions for aircraft approaching 3 times faster from unpredictable directions. The night torpedo attack represented perhaps the most revolutionary tactical development of the Pacific War's second half. TBF Avengers equipped with radar could locate enemy ships in complete darkness, approach undetected, and deliver torpedoes before Japanese lookouts even knew attackers were present. The first successful night torpedo attack occurred on November 30th, 1943, when Avengers from USS Enterprise located and attacked Japanese ships off Kwajalein Atoll. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound. Warships that had previously enjoyed relative safety during darkness now faced the constant threat of radar-guided torpedo attacks they could neither detect nor evade effectively. Lieutenant Commander William Martin, who pioneered night torpedo tactics with Enterprise's VT-6, described the advantages. In daylight, Japanese ships would spot our approach and begin evasive maneuvers while fighters scrambled to intercept us. At night, with radar guidance, we could position ourselves perfectly, approach to within 2,000 yards completely undetected, and release torpedoes before they even knew we were there. By the time they spotted our exhaust flames, torpedoes were already in the water running toward them. The hit rates we achieved at night exceeded anything possible in daylight attacks because the targets simply had no time to react. The technical capability enabling night attacks came from the ASB radar system installed in TBF Avengers, beginning in late 1943. This centimetric radar could detect ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles and provide accurate range and bearing information for attack runs. The radar operator, sitting in the Avengers midsection, would guide the pilot toward the target while monitoring for other ships or aircraft. As the range closed to 3,000 yards, the pilot would descend to attack altitude and line up his approach using the radar scope's presentation. At 2,000 yards, the radar operator would call range continuously while the pilot fine-tuned his heading. At 1,500 yards, the pilot would visually acquire the target and complete the attack using his torpedo sight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Training for night torpedo attacks required hundreds of practice runs until pilots could interpret radar returns and execute attacks without visual reference to the horizon. The disorientation of night flying over water, where there was no visible distinction between sky and sea, caused numerous training accidents. Pilots had to trust their instruments completely, maintaining precise altitude and airspeed through the entire approach, despite their inner ear insisting they were banking or climbing when they weren't. The accident rate during night training was sobering, but commanders recognized that operational effectiveness justified the training costs. Japanese naval forces operating at night believed themselves safe from air attack. Night-capable Avengers shattered that assumption. The strategic impact of reliable American torpedo bombing emerged clearly during the campaign for the Marianas in June and July 1944. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet with orders to engage and destroy the American carrier task force supporting the invasion of Saipan. Ozawa's battle plan depended on superior aircraft range, allowing Japanese carriers to strike American forces while remaining beyond American attack range. What Ozawa didn't fully appreciate was that American aircraft performance had improved dramatically since 1942, while Japanese aircraft development had stagnated. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes toward the American fleet. FXF Hellcat fighters, guided by fighter direction officers aboard the carriers, intercepted the Japanese formations and tore them apart. In what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for minimal American losses. But the decisive blow came not from fighters but from American submarines and subsequent carrier strikes targeting Ozawa's carriers. USS Albacore torpedoed the fleet carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. Damage control efforts failed, and fuel vapors accumulated throughout the ship. Hours later, a massive explosion ripped Taiho apart, sending her to the bottom with over 1,600 crew. USS Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, and she too succumbed to secondary explosions from aviation fuel vapors. These submarine successes demonstrated that torpedo effectiveness wasn't limited to aircraft delivery. Improved American torpedo technology benefited surface ships and submarines as much as carrier aviation. The following day, June 20th, American carriers launched a maximum effort strike against the retreating Japanese fleet. The strike departed late in the afternoon, guaranteeing that returning aircraft would face night carrier landings, one of naval aviation's most dangerous operations. Admiral Mark Mitcher authorized the strike despite the risks, recognizing that this represented the best opportunity to destroy Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. TBF Avengers from multiple squadrons participated in the strike, navigating over 300 miles to locate the Japanese fleet near the extreme limit of their combat radius. As the attack groups arrived over the target area at approximately 1840 hours, they found Japanese ships scattered across miles of ocean, maneuvering violently and throwing up intense anti-aircraft fire. The coordinated attack that Doctrine called for dissolved into multiple small engagements as different squadrons attacked whatever targets they could locate in the fading light. Despite the chaos, American torpedoes found their marks. The carrier Hio took at least one torpedo hit and began listing heavily. Secondary explosions from aviation fuel and munitions storage tore her through the ship. Within hours, she capsized and sank, taking over 250 crew with her. Japanese combat reports noted that American torpedo attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, making effective evasion impossible even when lookouts spotted the incoming aircraft. The flight turned into an epic of navigation and courage, as pilots struggled to find their carriers in complete darkness, with fuel gauges reading empty. Admiral Mitcher ordered all ships to turn on their lights, creating a beacon that guided exhausted pilots home, but also revealed the fleet's position to any Japanese submarines that might be lurking nearby. The calculated risk paid off. Most aircraft found their carriers and landed successfully, though some crashed on deck and others ditched alongside when their fuel ran out. The operation's success demonstrated that American naval aviation had achieved capabilities Japanese forces could no longer match. American pilots could find, attack, and destroy enemy ships at extreme range in marginal conditions while suffering acceptable losses. Japanese admirals analyzing the Philippine Sea defeat recognized that American torpedo bombing had become genuinely threatening for the first time in the war. Intelligence reports noted that American torpedoes ran faster and more reliably than previous models. Aircraft approached at higher speeds from unpredictable directions. Coordination between torpedo planes and dive bombers forced defenders to split their attention between high-altitude and low-altitude threats. Most concerning was the realization that American material advantage was accelerating. Every month brought more carriers, more aircraft, better-trained pilots, and improved weapons, while Japanese naval aviation declined in numbers and quality. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, analyzing tactical reports from the Philippine Sea, concluded that conventional naval aviation could no longer achieve decisive results against American forces. This assessment would lead directly to his advocacy for special attack units, the kamikaze strategy that represented Japan's admission that conventional tactics had failed. The psychological impact of effective American torpedo bombing extended beyond tactical defeats. Japanese naval aviators who had dominated the early war now faced opponents whose technology and training exceeded their own. The confidence born from victories at Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and Coral Sea evaporated as American forces demonstrated increasing superiority in every dimension of carrier warfare. The technological evolution of the Mark 13 torpedo continued throughout 1944. The Mod Dry version introduced improved propulsion that increased running speed from 33.5 knots to 40 knots, reducing the time enemy ships had to maneuver away from torpedo tracks. Range increased from 6,000 yards to over 9,000 yards, allowing pilots to release from safer distances against heavily defended targets. The explosive charge was upgraded to a more powerful Torpex mixture with improved detonator reliability. By late 1944, the Mark 13 Mod Dry had become one of the war's most effective aerial torpedoes, surpassing even the vaunted Japanese type 91 Zoll reliability and hitting power. Production of TBF Avengers reached industrial scale that Japanese factories couldn't begin to match. Grumman's Bethpage, New York facility produced 7,700 TBF models between 1942 and 1943. When Grumman needed additional capacity for fighter production, General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division took over Avenger production, building 7,500 TBM models that were identical except for manufacturer designation. Combined production exceeded 9,700 aircraft, making the Avenger one of the war's most produced torpedo bombers. This industrial capacity meant that American carriers always had replacement aircraft and trained crews available. Japanese carriers that lost aircraft in combat or to operational accidents struggled to obtain replacements. Trained pilots became increasingly scarce as experienced aviators were killed, and training programs produced inadequately prepared replacements. By late 1944, the average Japanese naval aviator had less than 100 hours flight time compared to over 300 hours for American pilots. This experience gap compounded technological disadvantages, creating a widening superiority that Japanese forces could not overcome. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 showcased American torpedo bombing at its devastating peak. During the complex multi-day engagement, TBF Avengers participated in strikes against all three Japanese naval forces, converging on the Philippines. On October 24th, Avengers from multiple carriers attacked Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force as it transited the Sibuyan Sea. Repeated torpedo and bomb attacks slowed the Japanese advance, sank the super battleship Musashi, and damaged multiple other vessels. The attacks convinced Kurita to temporarily withdraw westward before resuming his advance after dark. The sinking of Musashi demonstrated how far American torpedo capabilities had progressed. The massive battleship, displacing over 70,000 tons with armor designed to resist multiple torpedo hits, absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo strikes from multiple attack waves before finally capsizing. American pilots making repeated attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire showed none of the hesitation that had characterized earlier torpedo operations. They pressed attacks to close range, released their weapons, and escaped while making violent evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible in the slower TBD Devastators. On October 25th, Avengers participated in strikes against Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force, the decoy carrier group that successfully drew Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. Despite the Northern Force's sacrificial mission, Japanese crews fought desperately to defend their ships. American torpedo attacks from multiple directions overwhelmed the defenses. All four Japanese carriers were sunk, with torpedoes contributing to the destruction of Tsuekaku, last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, and light carriers Tsuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The most dramatic moment came off Samar Island when escort carriers and destroyers from Taffy 3 faced Kurita's center force, emerging from San Bernardino Strait. The 6 escort carriers, designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support rather than fleet engagements, launched every available aircraft in desperate attempts to slow the Japanese advance. TBM Avengers from composite squadrons made repeated attacks against Japanese battleships and cruisers, often with no torpedoes remaining and carrying only bombs or depth charges. Some made dry runs with no weapons at all, hoping to force Japanese ships to maneuver and slow their pursuit of the vulnerable carriers. Ensign Joseph McGraw from V-Chain, aboard USS Gambier Bay, described attacking the battleship Yamato with a single Mark Dreitzin torpedo. The ship was so large, it filled my entire windscreen as I dove toward it. Anti-aircraft fire was so thick, I couldn't see how any aircraft could fly through it. I released at what felt like point-blank range, maybe 800 yards, pulled up hard and went to full throttle. Looking back, I saw my torpedo running true toward the ship's side. Then Yamato's captain turned into the track, and my torpedo passed astern. I had done everything right. The torpedo had performed perfectly, and the target had still evaded. That's when I understood why we attacked in coordinated groups. 1 aircraft could be evaded. 20 aircraft attacking from different bearings couldn't all be avoided. The sacrifice of Taffy 3's aircraft and escort ships bought enough time for Japanese forces to withdraw, but the engagement demonstrated that even escort carriers operating at a severe disadvantage could mount effective torpedo attacks when necessity demanded. The TBM's reliability and the Mark Dreitzain's improved performance meant that even hastily organized attacks by relatively inexperienced pilots could achieve results that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Statistical analysis of American torpedo attacks from mid-1943 through war's end revealed dramatic improvement in effectiveness. Hit rates increased from less than 10% in early war engagements to between 30 and 45% by late 1944. Aircraft loss rates decreased from the catastrophic 85% suffered at Midway to between 5 and 15% in contested attacks. The exchange ratio shifted from dozens of aircraft lost for each ship sunk to multiple ships damaged or sunk for each aircraft lost. These improvements stemmed from better aircraft, better weapons, better tactics, and better training working synergistically to create a weapons system that Japanese defenses struggled to counter effectively. Japanese technical responses to improved American torpedo bombing proved inadequate. Anti-aircraft defenses were upgraded with additional 25mm guns, but the increased rate of fire couldn't compensate for the reduced engagement time created by faster American approaches. Japanese fighter tactics evolved to emphasize intercepting torpedo bombers before weapon release, but this played directly into American plans by drawing fighters away from dive bombers attacking simultaneously. Evasive maneuvering by ships became more aggressive, but coordinated multi-direction attacks meant that turning away from one torpedo spread exposed the ship to another. The most significant Japanese defensive adaptation was increasing emphasis on shore-based air power rather than carrier aviation. Admiral Onishi's kamikaze strategy represented an extreme version of this shift, using aircraft as guided missiles rather than reusable weapons platforms. While kamikaze attacks inflicted serious losses on American forces, the tactic reflected strategic desperation rather than tactical innovation. Japan was trading trained pilots for one-time attacks because they could no longer compete in conventional carrier warfare, where American superiority in aircraft quality, pilot training, and weapons effectiveness had become overwhelming. The human experience of flying torpedo attacks evolved dramatically between early war disasters and late war successes. Lieutenant Charles Henderson, who flew TBDs at Midway and survived to transition to TBF Avengers, described the psychological difference. In the TBD, you knew you were flying into a meat grinder, the aircraft was slow, the torpedo was unreliable, and your chances of surviving the attack were poor. Every pilot climbing into a Devastator wondered if this would be his last flight. In the Avenger, with the improved Mark Dreitzain, you still faced danger, but you had confidence that your aircraft could absorb battle damage and keep flying, that your torpedo would run true if you released it properly, and that your speed and maneuverability gave you real chances of getting home. That psychological shift from resigned acceptance of probable death to confidence in survivability made us more aggressive and more effective. Training for torpedo attacks became increasingly sophisticated as operational experience accumulated. Replacement pilots arriving at fleet squadrons in 1944 underwent extensive practice with dummy torpedoes before being cleared for combat operations. They learned to judge release points instinctively, to coordinate with other aircraft in their division, to recognize and respond to anti-aircraft fire patterns, and to execute emergency procedures when battle damage made normal flight impossible. The training was demanding and occasionally fatal when mistakes occurred, but it produced pilots whose skill level exceeded anything Japanese training programs could match by war's end. The strategic impact of effective American torpedo bombing extended beyond individual ship sinkings to fundamental alterations in Japanese naval strategy. The strategic impact of effective American torpedo bombing extended beyond individual ship sinkings to fundamental alterations in Japanese naval strategy. By late 1944, Japanese naval commanders recognized that operating their remaining carriers within range of American land-based or carrier-based aircraft invited catastrophic losses they could not afford. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers and light carriers, now possessed only a handful of operational carriers with inadequate aircraft and poorly trained aircrew. The decision to use carriers as decoys during later Gulf reflected this reality. Japanese carriers had become bait rather than striking weapons, their primary value lying in their ability to draw American forces away from more important objectives. The operational radius of TBF Avengers carrying Mark Dreitzen torpedoes created zones of control around American carrier task forces that Japanese surface ships could not safely enter. With combat radius exceeding 500 miles when carrying a full torpedo load, Avengers could strike targets up to 250 miles from their carriers. This meant American task forces projected offensive capability across circles of ocean 500 miles in diameter. Japanese surface forces, attempting to close within gun range of American amphibious landings, had to transit these zones under continuous threat of torpedo attack. The psychological burden on Japanese commanders knowing that radar-equipped Avengers might appear at any moment, day or night, degraded combat effectiveness, even when actual attacks didn't materialize. Vice Admiral Matoma Ugaki, commanding battleship forces during the final year of the war, wrote extensively in his diary about the changed tactical environment. American air power had created conditions where surface ships could no longer maneuver freely in contested waters. Every movement had to account for probable air attacks. Every formation had to balance tactical positioning against anti-aircraft defense requirements. The constant threat of torpedo attack forced ships to maintain high speeds and execute frequent course changes, consuming fuel at rates that exceeded what Japan's deteriorating logistics could sustain. Ugaki recognized that Japan had lost air superiority so completely that surface forces were relegated to suicidal missions, with no realistic hope of success. The mining campaign against Japanese home waters in 1945 demonstrated the TBF Avenger's versatility beyond pure torpedo operations. Beginning in March 1945, Benoi-20 superfortresses from the 20th Air Force began dropping acoustic and magnetic mines in the Shimonoseki Strait and other vital waterways, but carrier-based Avengers also participated extensively in mining operations. The aircraft could carry 2,000-pound mines internally just as easily as torpedoes, and the crew training for precise navigation and low-altitude delivery transferred directly to mine-laying missions. Mining operations required different tactics than torpedo attacks. Aircraft would approach designated dropping zones at night or in marginal weather, descend to between 800 and 1,500 feet, and release mines with parachutes that slowed their descent into the water. The mines would sink to predetermined depths and activate after preset delays, creating minefields that forced Japanese shipping into predictable channels where submarines could ambush them, or into harbors where they became targets for subsequent attacks. The cumulative effect of mining operations complemented the direct destruction caused by torpedo attacks, creating a comprehensive blockade that strangled Japan's maritime commerce. Lieutenant Commander Richard Roby, leading mine-laying missions from USS Hancock, described the operational challenges. In precision than torpedo attacks, because dropping zones were typically in confined waters with nearby land masses. Navigation had to be perfect because missing the drop zone meant mines would be wasted in wrong locations. We flew at altitudes where any mechanical malfunction could be fatal because we had no margin for recovery. But the strategic payoff was enormous. A dozen well-placed mines could close a harbor for days, forcing the Japanese to dedicate minesweepers and escorts to clearance operations rather than convoy protection. The effectiveness of American mining became apparent through Japanese shipping losses. By May 1945, shipping through the inland sea had been reduced to less than 10% of previous levels. Ports like Kure and Sasebo became effectively blockaded. Ships that did attempt transit faced high probability of sinking either from mines or from submarine attacks in the predictable channels mine avoidance forced them into. The combination of submarine warfare, aerial mining, and direct torpedo attacks destroyed Japanese merchant marine as an effective logistics system. By July 1945, Japan's ability to import food, fuel, and raw materials had collapsed to the point where industrial production was declining precipitously and civilian populations faced actual starvation. Individual stories from TBF Avenger crews captured the human dimension of technological warfare. Aviation radioman 2nd Class J. Moore, flying as radar operator and gunner aboard an Avenger from USS Essex, described his experience during a night torpedo attack in January 1945. We launched at 2200 hours in complete darkness. I activated the radar and began searching while our pilot climbed to 8,000 feet. At 30 miles, I detected a large return, probably a cruiser or battleship. I guided our pilot toward the contact while monitoring for other ships or aircraft. As we closed to 5 miles, I could see multiple returns suggesting the target was part of a task force. Our division leader decided to attack the largest ship. We descended to 1,000 feet, and I called ranges continuously. At 2,000 yards, the pilot told me he had visual contact. At 1,500 yards, I felt the aircraft shudder as he released the torpedo. We dove to wavetop height and escaped at maximum speed. Looking back, I saw a massive explosion as our torpedo struck. The target was definitely hit, probably crippled. The entire attack from initial detection to weapon release took maybe 20 minutes. The Japanese never even knew we were there until the torpedo hit. The technical evolution of the TBF Avenger continued through the war's final months. The TBM dry model, introduced in April 1944, featured upgraded Wright R2620 engines with 2,300 horsepower, substantially improving performance at higher altitudes and with heavier loads. Strengthened wings allowed increased fuel capacity, extending range to over 1,000 miles. Enhanced armor protection around the engine and cockpit improved crew survivability against anti-aircraft fire. Some aircraft received rocket rails, allowing them to carry 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets in addition to their torpedo, creating multi-role attack capability that made efficient use of limited carrier deck space. The addition of rocket armament transformed attack doctrine. Avengers could now suppress anti-aircraft positions with rockets during the final approach to torpedo release, then attack the now suppressed target with torpedoes. Alternatively, if no suitable torpedo targets presented themselves, the same aircraft could deliver effective strikes against shore installations, small craft, or ground targets. This flexibility meant that no mission ended without achieving some result. Even if primary torpedo targets weren't located, Avengers would find secondary targets and deliver whatever ordnance they carried rather than jettisoning weapons and returning to the carrier empty. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined American torpedo operations comprehensively. The survey concluded that aerial torpedoes sank or damaged over 273 Japanese naval vessels and merchant ships exceeding 1,000 tons. When combined with submarine-launched torpedoes, the weapon accounted for over half of all Japanese shipping losses. The survey specifically credited the improved Mark-Dreitzehn Mod Dry with transforming aerial torpedo operations from marginally effective to decisively important. Hit rates with the modified weapon exceeded 40% in optimal conditions, approaching the reliability of surface-launched torpedoes, while offering the advantage of rapid deployment over much longer distances. The survey also analyzed Japanese perspectives through interrogation of surviving naval officers. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata, who commanded destroyer squadrons throughout the war, stated that American torpedo attacks became progressively more dangerous as the war continued. Early attacks were predictable and could usually be evaded through aggressive maneuvering. By 1944, coordinated attacks from multiple directions at high speed made evasion nearly impossible. The torpedoes themselves ran faster and more reliably than our intelligence had suggested. When combined with dive bombing attacks occurring simultaneously, we faced impossible defensive challenges. Ships had to choose which threat to prioritize, and inevitably some attacks would succeed, regardless of what defensive measures we took. The technological triumph, represented by the TBF Avenger and Mark Dreitzin torpedo combination, stemmed from systematic problem-solving rather than individual genius. The transformation required contributions from aircraft designers at Grumman, who created an airframe robust enough to absorb battle damage and powerful enough to carry heavy loads at high speeds. It required ordnance engineers at Newport, who redesigned the torpedo based on operational feedback rather than theoretical specifications. It required operational commanders who developed tactics exploiting technological capabilities rather than adhering to obsolete doctrine. Most importantly, it required combat pilots who tested modifications under fire and provided detailed after-action reports that drove continuous improvement. Captain Deke Parsons, whose leadership of torpedo development proved crucial, never received public recognition proportional to his contribution. He went on to serve as weaponeer aboard Enola Gay during the Hiroshima mission, manually arming the atomic bomb during flight, then led nuclear weapons development during the early Cold War. His obituary in 1953 mentioned his atomic weapons work prominently, but barely referenced his torpedo development achievements. Only decades later did naval historians recognize that Parsons' rehabilitation of the Mark Dreitzin had been as important to Pacific victory as any single weapons development program. The TBF Avenger remained in service through the immediate post-war period, participating in some of the final combat operations of World War II. On August 9, 1945, as the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, American carriers launched strikes against Japanese positions in northern Honshu and Hokkaido. TBF Avengers participated in these final attacks, delivering torpedoes against shipping in Japanese ports and laying mines in harbors. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, Avengers were among the aircraft conducting final reconnaissance missions to verify that Japanese forces were indeed standing down. The abrupt end to combat operations left thousands of TBF and TBM Avengers suddenly without mission. In one of history's great wastes of military resources, most were simply pushed overboard from carriers or scrapped at forward bases. The peacetime military had no use for thousands of torpedo bombers designed for a war that had ended. A few dozen were retained for training purposes or modified for specialized roles like anti-submarine warfare or airborne early warning. But the vast majority of the 9,700 Avengers produced were destroyed within months of war's end, their combat records forgotten as attention shifted to atomic weapons and jet aircraft. The legacy of the TBF Avenger and the Mark Dreitzin torpedo extended beyond World War II into the jet age and missile era. The fundamental problem they solved, delivering large warheads accurately against moving ships, remained central to naval warfare. Modern anti-ship missiles trace their conceptual lineage directly to aerial torpedoes, replacing human pilots with electronic guidance, but maintaining the same goal of penetrating below the waterline to inflict catastrophic damage. The doctrine of coordinated multi-axis attacks that proved so effective, with Avengers attacking simultaneously with dive bombers, evolved into modern strike packages where different weapons attack from different vectors to overwhelm. Defenses. The human cost of developing effective torpedo bombing doctrine was measured in hundreds of aircrew killed during the learning process. The TBD crews who died at Midway, the training accidents that killed dozens more during development of night attack procedures, the combat losses suffered while tactics evolved from theoretical concepts to proven methods, all represented the price of transforming an ineffective weapons system into a war-winning capability. Their sacrifice made possible the successes achieved by later crews flying improved aircraft with better weapons and benefiting from accumulated operational experience. For Japanese naval aviation, the emergence of effective American torpedo bombing represented a technological and tactical defeat from which recovery proved impossible. Early war advantages in aircraft performance, pilot skill, and torpedo effectiveness were systematically eroded by an opponent with superior industrial capacity, more flexible doctrine, and willingness to learn from failure. By war's end, Japanese naval aviation had been reduced to kamikaze attacks because conventional methods could no longer achieve meaningful results against American forces, whose qualitative and quantitative superiority had become absolute. The transformation of American torpedo, aviation from the disasters of 1942 to the dominance of 1944 and 45, stands as one of the Pacific War's most remarkable turnarounds. It demonstrated that technological inferiority could be overcome through systematic engineering improvement, that tactical doctrine could evolve rapidly based on combat experience, and that initial failures didn't doom a weapons system if leadership maintained commitment to solving underlying problems. The 2,000-pound torpedoes, carried by TBF Avengers, represented not just explosive weapons, but the culmination of years of engineering effort, operational testing, and combat refinement that created a capability Japanese admirals had no effective answer for. When Ensign Albert Earnest struggled to keep his damaged Avenger flying after the Midway attack, wounded and with his gunner and radio man dead, he couldn't have known that the aircraft he barely managed to land represented the future of American naval aviation. The 6 Avengers at Midway suffered catastrophic losses, matching the TBD squadrons they were meant to supplement. But unlike the TBD, which was immediately recognized as obsolete and withdrawn from service, the Avenger proved adaptable to continuous improvement. Better engines, better weapons, better tactics, and better training transformed it from a promising design into a war-winning system that helped strangle Japanese naval power and contributed decisively to Allied victory in the Pacific. The story of how Japanese admirals were stunned when TBF Avengers carried 2,000-pound torpedoes isn't really about the weight of the weapon. It's about the systematic transformation of American naval aviation from technological inferiority to overwhelming superiority through relentless problem-solving, institutional learning, and industrial capacity that Japan could neither match nor counter. The Mark Dreitzin torpedo that barely worked in 1942 became by 1944 one of history's most effective aerial weapons. The TBF Avenger, that suffered devastating losses at Midway, became the most produced American torpedo bomber and one of the war's most successful aircraft. Together, they represented the material and intellectual superiority that characterized American military operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. Japanese admirals who analyzed intelligence reports about American torpedo capabilities in early 1943 genuinely were stunned by the rapid improvement in aircraft performance, weapon reliability, and tactical effectiveness. Their stunned surprise reflected recognition that the balance of naval aviation had shifted irreversibly against them. The aircraft they had dominated in 1942 now exceeded Japanese capabilities. The torpedoes they had easily evaded now struck with devastating reliability. The tactics they had defeated through superior skill now overwhelmed their defenses through coordination and speed they couldn't counter. That stunning reversal, more than any single battle or campaign, marked the turning point where Japanese naval aviation transitioned from attacker to victim, from confident superiority to desperate defense, from expecting victory to hoping merely to survive. And it happened because American engineers solved the torpedo problem, American industry built thousands of capable aircraft, and American pilots developed tactics exploiting those capabilities to their fullest potential. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.